Well, the concept of reinvention of self is a concept in neuroscience that everybody's beginning to understand as a possibility. So let's talk about this concept called mental rehearsal, and then we'll talk about how it applies to quantum physics. Okay? In other words, if we believe that our thoughts have something to do with our destiny, how does subjective mind have an effect on the objective world? How does subjective mind produce measurable, intentional, objective changes in physical reality? So, they did an experiment a little ways back where they took a group of people who pretty much never played the piano before. They divided them into 4 different categories. In the first group of people, they said, listen, we're going to teach you these one-handed finger exercises, scales and chords. We want you to come every day for 2 hours a day for 5 days. You practice these scales and chords. We're going to do a functional brain scan of your brain before. We're going to do a functional brain scan of your brain afterwards. And we're going to see if you've actually grown new circuits. Now, functional brain scans are like a motion picture of the brain. Regular CAT scans and MRIs are like a snapshot of the brain. We're looking for anatomy. We're looking for broken parts. We're looking for missing parts, injuries. But a functional scan allows us to see the brain in action, or to see the brain at work. And whenever we study the brain in action, the brain at work, that's called mind. Mind is what the brain does. So they said, okay, to the first group, come and play the scales and chords every single day. And after we do the scan, we want to see if you've grown any new circuits. So the people came and played every single day, and after 5 days, of course, they grew a whole new set of circuits on the opposite side of their brain. Well, that makes sense. If you learn something new, learning's making new connections. You get some instructions. The instruction is to apply what you've learned, to the learn how process, to get your body involved, what your mind has intellectually understood. You're going to reinforce those circuits. If you pay attention and you repeat it over and over again, you're going to absolutely grow new circuits. That's how we grow circuits. So these people grew a measurable amount of circuits on the opposite side of the brain. Second group of people, they said, come for 2 hours a day for 5 days. We'll scan your brain before, we'll scan your brain after. But listen, you come and play whatever you want. And at the end of 5 days, hardly anything happened. Why? Because they didn't get any knowledge, so they didn't make any new connections. They got no instruction. They couldn't repeat what they did the day before because they couldn't remember. And, of course, they couldn't pay attention. So there was no template or no map for them to follow to reinforce circuitry. The repetition. But the template starts out with learning. Right? If you learn the scales and chords, then if you apply what you learn and you get some instruction, now that process is an experience, and the experience shapes the brain. So the third group of people, they said, don't even show up. And, of course, there was no change in their brain at all. In other words, don't learn anything new, don't do anything differently, and your brain doesn't change. The last group of people, they said, come for 2 hours a day for 5 days. We'll scan your brain before, we'll scan your brain after. But listen, what we want you to do is we want you to close your eyes, and we want you to mentally rehearse playing the scales and chords. At the end of 5 days, they grew the same amount of circuits as the people who physically demonstrated the activity. Now, that was a monumental experiment because it showed that we can change our brain just by thinking differently. And not only that, when we're truly focused and we're truly paying attention, because of the size of the frontal lobe, the brain does not know the difference between what's happening out there and what's happening in here. In other words, the thought becomes the experience in and of itself when we're truly focused. Now, why is that? Well, the frontal lobe is kind of like the volume control of the brain. It makes up 40% of our entire brain, largest in human beings and any other species. And it's the seat of our free will. It's where we invent. It's when we speculate. It's when we pay attention, when we plan, when we remember, when we make decisions. It's the CEO of the brain. It's the symphony leader of the brain. But when we're learning or when we're paying attention or when we're planning and we're deciding, we don't want to be distracted by any other extraneous stimuli. So the frontal lobe literally lowers the volume to time and space. It literally lowers the volume to the feedback from the environment, the feedback from our body, and even our awareness of time. So when that happens, we get very present with what we're doing. And when we get present, that's the moment we make circuits, we make connections. So the people who were playing the piano were so involved with what they were thinking about, so focused on what they were doing, that the thought became the experience, and the circuitry reflected in the brain a new mind. So when we change our mind, the brain changes. When we change our brain, we change our mind. So it's a complete cycle. So how does that apply to you and I? Well, if we asked ourselves, what is the greatest expression of ourself? And we sat down and began to think independent of the environment. We closed our eyes and eliminated the stimulus that we normally perceive. The brainwave patterns would begin to slow down. So much so that we would begin to relax the body enough so that the brain and body are no longer distracted. The moment that that happens, if we started to answer the question, what is the greatest expression of myself? What is the greatest ideal of myself? What would it be like to be happy? Who do I know in my life that's a happy person? What would I have to change about myself in order to live in joy? Who in history do I admire that I want to be like? If we had the patience to sit down and answer that question, we would begin to force the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And if we can make the brain fire in different combinations or different patterns, we're making a new mind, right? We're changing mind. So we can change our brain just by thinking, but you may say, well, what is that? That doesn't really change the body. How does that change the body? Well, they did another experiment where they took a group of people and they said, look, we want you to pull a spring with your finger for an hour a day for 4 weeks. And at the end of 4 weeks, people, when they tested the muscle strength of that finger, there was a 30% increase in muscle strength. Well, that makes sense, right? You put a load on a muscle, there's resistance. You continuously stress the muscle fibers are going to break down, and it's going to grow bigger proteins so they can handle a bigger load. Normal physiology. But in another group, they said, come for an hour a day for 4 weeks, but instead of actually pulling the spring, we want you to mentally rehearse pulling the spring. And at the end of 4 weeks, they had a 22% increase in muscle strength. Now, they never touched the spring. So which means now, in the piano playing experiment, the brain and the mind were ahead of the actual experience of playing the piano. In other words, the brain looked like, if we looked at the brain after they did the rehearsal, the brain looked like they actually physically played the piano. So the brain was ahead of the actual experience. In the finger exercise, now 22% increase in muscle strength never touched the spring. That means now the brain and the mind and the body are ahead of the actual experience. So how does that happen? Again, the concept in neuroscience, nerve cells that fire together, wire together. You fire the same thoughts, think the same thoughts over and over again. The neurons continuously fire, they continuously fire. There comes a moment where the neurons release this chemical. It's like a miracle grow. It's like a fertilizer. It's like a glue that causes neurons to develop not only a long-term relationship with each other, but sprout more intricate connections. So now there's a more refined network of neurons, a greater capacity for mind, a greater intention, which sends a stronger signal down the central nervous system. And it's their mind that literally moves that spring. So then you say, well, it didn't change the body physically. There was no physical changes in the body, but the finger was actually stronger. So they did another experiment where they took a group of men that they asked them to come and mentally rehearse curling a dumbbell in their mind over and over again. And at the end of the experiment, these men had a 13% increase in the size of their bicep, and they never touched the weights. Now we're seeing now that through rehearsal, through the proper rehearsal, we can prepare the brain, the mind, and the body to be ahead of the actual experience. Which means then, if subjective mind is going to have an effect on the objective world, if the brain and the mind and body are reflecting the event as if the experience happened, it means in the quantum field, the experience finds us. Because the brain and body and mind are prepared for the experience. Now, the problem is with most people, they're so conditioned by the environment that to think without the environment, they realize how conditioned their mind is to pay attention to the extraneous stimuli that they've been conditioned to pay attention to. So the virtual world crumbles for them, or crumbles for us, I should say, when we're distracted by stressors and events and people and things we have to do, because the stream of consciousness is interrupted with our circuitry that we've developed from our own poor neural habits. So the idea then is that how do we learn how to pay attention? How do we learn how to get present? How do we learn how to move into a state in which the internal world is actually greater than the external world? Because if we're able to do that, the willful changes that take place, because it has to take will, it doesn't work when you're watching television or you're watching a virtual show, because there's no will involved. There has to be intention. There has to be free will involved, because it's consciousness now which becomes aware of its own actions that's going to upscale the hardware of the brain. So let's talk about video gaming, because it's a phenomenon in our culture right now. So here's a kid, he's playing his video games, and every time he or she plays a video game and they blow somebody up, or break through a wall, or shoot something down, or punch somebody, or kick them, or score, or whatever they do, there's an amazing release of dopamine in their brain. And dopamine is the pleasure chemical. And if they're shooting and they're attacking, just like the army folks who are watching the virtual world and producing adrenaline, they're producing adrenaline or norepinephrine in their brain. So now you have the pleasure center being stimulated, and you have adrenaline turning on the brain for super awareness. Right? Well, you play that enough times, the next time the child plays, they need a little bit more of a rush to turn on the same mechanisms. In other words, the pleasure centers in the brain recalibrate to a higher level. So now it takes more chemistry, more blowing up, more playing to produce the same physiological high. Now, that's not learning. That's associative memory. That's reacting. That's conditioning. That's impulse reaction. So now you take the kid and you bring them to school. Now learning should be a reward in and of itself. And now the child is not getting the same rush in the pleasure centers. And by the way, the pleasure centers is way higher than most kids. And they're not getting the adrenal glands turned on to cause the brain to be aware and awake. So what do? They fall asleep, or they get in trouble. And when they get in trouble, they have now a hyperactive attention deficit disorder. Well, why? Well, they're trying to produce the same chemistry so that their brain wakes up so that they can feel alive. And so the receptor sites become desensitized. And it always takes a little bit more of a rush or a little bit more chemical hit to be able to turn on those mechanisms. So what happens to the child when they're not playing video games? When they can go out and watch a sunset, or walk with their grandparent, or sit down at dinner and talk to their parents. They're aggressive, or their pleasure centers are so high that they begin to experience this thing called anhedonia, which means you can't get pleasure from anything. And so what do? When they realize that nothing in their environment turns them on, they go back to gaming. Or they buy another game that's a little bit further over the top to get the same rush. And hence you see the brain chemistry changing dramatically. And the quickness in the shift in attention spans actually shortens brain activity in terms of the frontal lobe. And it creates kind of like a chronic distractibility, where they're always distracted from one event to the next because their brain has been conditioned that way. So that's not focus. That's actually reaction. And it actually messes up circuitry in the brain. You have to be present. Time and space have to disappear. Just like, for example, as you and I are talking, there's a hum over here, but it's not important to us, so our brain lowers the volume to that. And so when we're meditating and we're truly focused or we're truly paying attention, when the frontal lobe lowers the volume to the extraneous stimuli, sensory information from the body, the motor centers in the brain shut off. In other words, there's no mind there any longer. So there's no activity there. If there's no activity, there's no mind. The parietal centers, the circuits for time and space, they shut off. So there is no time. Yeah, the lights go out. So now the only thing that's being processed is the thought. The emotional centers cool down as well. And so now the reality is the thought. And that's when the brain captures it and begins to pattern it three-dimensionally. I mean, my definition of true presence and true attention is when I forget about myself. When you're so involved with what you're doing that you want to elongate the moment. You want it to last. You're not running from it, but you're enjoying, you're expanding into the moment instead of contracting from the moment. Oh, by the way, neuroscience is actually showing right now that attention is a skill, that you can improve it. Just like golf or tennis or any other skill that you learn, that the more you pay attention and the more you practice being attentive, the more the brain will change. And the brain will begin to produce brainwave patterns that are more coherent on an electroencephalograph. That coherent frequency or that coherent pattern is when neurons love to gang up and dance to the same rhythm and make new circuits and new connections. So we can take people who have attention problems and we can train them then to begin to improve their attention so that so mind has more control over the body. Consciousness is our awareness. It's an awareness. So when we're aware and we're present with whatever thought we're embracing, the brain can record the event, the thought as an experience. And so most of the time in our waking day, our awareness is on the body, the environment, and time. Our brains are conditioned to pay attention to the environment through our senses and to be aware of our body and how it's feeling and to be aware of time. That's a very simple survival mechanism. And it's also kind of this pain and pleasure mechanism because the thinking brain is always evaluating the environment to determine what's going to feel good based on its memory. It's going to want to move towards that and move away from what's going to be uncomfortable and what feels bad. Now that's basically how we've learned throughout our entire life. You know, when an infant is young and it cries out and it gets fed, it learns to associate crying out with being fed because that is a positive identification or association that gives rise to a habit or a behavior. Something externally from me produces some internal chemical change. And that external thing producing this internal chemical change, I'm going to notice my internal subjective chemical change and I'm going to pay attention to that so the next time I know how to get it. Move towards comfort. By the same means, if you put your finger on the hot stove as a kid or stick a fork in the light socket, in a matter of seconds you learn to associate pain with that activity. So 1 or 2 times, maybe 3, you start to pay attention with that internal chemical change called pain with that external event. And that causes us to develop negative associations or identifications that give rise to habits and behaviors. So we're conditioned in our life to move towards feeling good and move away from feeling bad. Now that's really good in terms of chemical needs and development. But when we get into bad habits, then it becomes interesting because to change is an uncomfortable process. To change is to think greater than how you feel. To think greater than your current chemical continuity. To think greater than the conditions in your environment. And to think greater than time. In other words, we have to think and act greater than what we typically do with the environment, the body, and time. It means we have to shift our attention from the constant stimulation from the body, the environment, and time, and begin to think in different ways. And so the other means of development is called creation. And when we're truly creating, there is no body, there is no thing, there is no time. In the process of creation, the brain now begins to work in different ways so that we can plan we can devise a strategy, we can think about how we can modify our behavior, and as we begin to speculate possibilities, the brain, the frontal lobe, begins to take all of the knowledge and experience that it has, the neural networks that are reflected in terms of things we philosophically know or events we've experienced, and our wisdom as well, and begins to seamlessly piece it together to create a new idea or a new model. And now that new model becomes the plan. Now, it takes a few times to reinforce the circuitry to maintain that level of mind. Because the moment some extraneous thought takes place in our brain or some stimulus in the environment activates the familiar circuits, we forget our intentions. We forget what we were just planning on becoming. And so there's this tug of war between the old self and the new self. There's a strong pull back to the familiar self. So the importance of retreating from our world at times, retreating from our typical environment, the familiar people and the familiar job, the familiar things we do at the familiar place, no longer letting the environment to control our thinking, and we retreat from the environment. We begin to ask ourselves these frontal lobe questions. That is the reinvention process in and of itself, that as we begin to retreat from the world and we begin to separate ourselves from the typical stimuli, we're no longer acting and activating the same circuits, which gives the brain a chance to think independently of the environment. And as we said last time, that's what meditation is to become familiar with the old self, its unconscious thoughts, actions, and feelings, and become so familiar with it that we can now gain conscious control over it. And then to then reinvent a new self and be able to familiarize ourselves with that new mind and be able to reproduce that mind at will and make it look natural and easy. Now we have a new self emerging. And that new self will have a new stream of consciousness that comes with it and a new set of chemical messengers or messages to the body that signal the body to feel in love or enlightened or inspired or generous or free or whatever we want to do. So we can create a new cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking that can become a new automatic state of being. But it's important to unlearn the old pattern. And we can't just go for the new without cultivating and pulling out the old and changing the old. So the process of meditation or the process of contemplation or the process of thinking without the environment takes focused concentration. And it also takes learning new things, because when we learn new things, the learning of that new thing creates the raw materials for us to begin to say, I got more building materials for a bigger idea of myself, a bigger dream, a bigger vision for myself or for the world. So that's why the learning keeps the brain active. It's developing new circuits. We're weighing what we know against what we don't know. We're weighing if we believe this, or we're analyzing it, or we're evaluating it, and we're finding a way to fit it into our neural structures to then build a bigger belief or a bigger perception of the way reality is. And then, of course, as we do that, we're able to then interact with in reality with more machinery to be able to see what's always existed, but we may not have ever seen it because we didn't have the circuitry in place to see it.
Creating this ego is the one that creates this separation.
The ego is the when we get rooted in our ego, it means that all the automatic emotional states have been finalized, our behaviors are complete, and our thinking and our attitudes are predictable. And so when the ego is living as the ego, it's concerned about self. Its attention is on self. And because we have to survive in a culture, in a world that requires us to live in survival, the chemicals of survival drive the ego to push for what it wants, right? To push or force or gain control of, to repel, I guess. To get what we want, we have to use force to get it. Or the opposite, the ego pulls, or it attaches, or it addicts itself to it, becomes addicted to, or needs. So then holds on would be a great word to use. So that's the extremity of the reflection of the way we really are, which is both intention and surrender, thought and emotion, or activity, or focused concentration. The electrical field and the magnetic field become very polarized in the end. And so when the chemicals of stress push us into survival, we're thinking about how we can get what we want for ourselves in a certain amount of time in the environment by using our body, by using our senses, by being animal in a sense, just being overly exerting, pushing. And then by the same means, for certain people, the chemicals of stress drive them into weakness and depression and holding on and contraction. And they're attached. And so they become attached to memories and emotions. But that's the extremity. And the ego works, it holds itself in place with that very large extremity. And so as we begin to grow and change and we move more towards the midline, as we move towards the midline of the ego self, we let go of the extremity of holding on. And we let go of the extremity of pushing for what we want, or controlling for what we want, forcing what we want. And as we give up the extremity of those things, we move more towards balance. We move more towards being whole. And I guess the idea is that when fear is taken away, and aggression is taken away, and sadness is taken away, those primitive negative emotions that are run by those chemicals, we find ourselves in a state of joy. And that joy is the natural state of being. It's the presence of the moment. And so children come in with, unless they're in harsh conditions, they come in with that joy already running through them. So they're not in survival, they're not concerned about that, so they can be present. And children want to elongate the moment. That's why when you say to a kid, you know, Juanito, come on inside, it's time to eat, they say, I'm not hungry. And then you say, well, it's cold out there, put your jacket on. And they say, I'm not cold. And then you say, well, it's getting late, it's time to go to bed. Well, I'm not tired. Well, come on in and take a bath, you're dirty. I don't care if I'm dirty. Now you say to an adult, come on in, it's time to eat. They say, yeah, let's eat. You say, come on in, it's time to take a bath. Okay, make sure the water's hot. So we're striving for that relief from the moment. We're striving to run away from that discomfort that is now developed within us. And so the children have that because their brainwave patterns are slower. A child that's born is functioning for the most part in delta waves. They're asleep with their eyes open. And they get a little older, then they move into theta. And when they're in theta, all the sensory information is going right into the subconscious brain. But in effect, it's the same thing. What external cue is producing some internal chemical change, and I'm going to associate or identify this little mechanism. And it takes no conscious control to do that. To search for pain or run away from pleasure, not a lot of conscious activity goes on with that. It's actually very primitive and very stimulus response based. And it ultimately comes to the point where you ring the bell and you salivate. It's the same thing. You see the person, you see the event, and your body immediately responds without the conscious mind. There's no conscious mind involved in that type of activity, except in the immediate moment. And the 2 or 3 stimuli in association allows the conscious brain to go to sleep. And it's the body that primarily makes those decisions. So the adult then, as an adult, there are events that happen in our life that we tag emotionally important. Whether your mother tells you you're fat, or your father abuses you, or you get fired from a job for something that you didn't do, or you lose someone that you love, or your husband leaves you with children, or your wife is doing whatever it is, we tag those emotional events as important. And the memory of those emotional events actually produces the same chemistry as if the event was happening. And then that emotional state becomes who we are. Now, the more addicted we are to emotions, or the more attached we are to that emotional identity, the bigger the gap between the way we appear and who we really are. Who we really are is empty and hurting, or unhappy, or suffering. So what we do is that pain is so uncomfortable, we decide to build this identity to look smart, to be successful, to own a lot of cars, to be pretty, to do whatever we can. And we need the environment, the people in our life, the things that we do, the places we go, where we live, the times we're there. All the environmental information is important to stimulate the brain to create this facade of being a somebody, because it's too painful to be this. So we run from this feeling and we create this identity, this personality that needs the environment to remember itself. So, you know these people, you go to these places, you belong to these clubs, you do these things, you own these things, you own the boat, you own the car, and all of that you need to remember yourself as the somebody. They're strong ego markers. And so what happens is somewhere in our life, right around the 40s or the 50s, we begin to realize that we can predict the feeling that's connected to all of these things, and none of that makes us happy. So then what do people do? It's the midlife crisis, right? They go out and buy the new sports car, right? Some external thing is going to produce some internal chemical change, and I'm going to use this to make my pain or my emptiness go away. I'm aging and I don't like myself any longer, so I'll buy the Harley Davidson. I'll buy the new boat. The affair. It could be joining the new social club, the new golf club, and meeting the new people so we feel important. To reaffirm, to try to remember this identity, because without all of this, you're left with this. And incidentally, when we die, and all of this is taken away, all the environment is taken away, we're left with this down here. We're left with that emotional feeling that somebody, and we haven't evolved in a lifetime if we've never owned that emotion. So, you could be the wealthiest man in the world, or the wealthiest woman in the world, and be the prettiest woman in the world, and have all the things you want. But if this feeling doesn't go away in your lifetime, and you don't know how to change that, then at the end of your life, you haven't evolved much at all. So, the people who realize in the midlife crisis that the environment doesn't make them feel good, and by the way, it takes enormous amounts of energy to keep this all going. I call it spinning plates. You got to spin a lot of plates to keep it all going, to run away from that feeling, right? And some people, in the middle of their life, they say, I'm not going to keep my emotional agreements any longer. I'm not going to keep my emotional connection to my husband. I'm unhappy. I'm going to just start not pretending that I'm happy any longer. I'm not going to be distracted by extraneous things so I can continuously run away from them. Some people say the game's up. I quit. And I don't want to keep it all going. And then they just stop their agreements and they fall down to this person down here. Their family sees that. They take them to the doctor and they give them a little Prozac. And next thing you know, they're back shaking hands and smiling and pretending like everything's okay. Now, those people who don't do that, and the novelty of the sports car wears off, or the novelty of the affair wears off, or the novelty of the new social club, or going on vacation, when all that wears off, because when they come back and it's over, they're back to that same feeling. They go to the next level. And what is that? That's video gaming. That's drugs. That's alcohol. That's gambling. That's overeating. That's shopping too much. That's pornography. Anything, we'll use anything because people don't know what else is there to make this feeling go away. And as they search for things that are addictive, like drugs produce enormous chemical changes that make the person feel great. The problem is that the next time they use the drug, they need a little bit more, because the receptor sites on the outside of the cells become desensitized. It's like living with a spouse that always yells at you. They got to yell a little bit louder to turn on your attention. Well, to turn on the cell, a little bit more chemistry the next time. So instead of gambling for $50,000, we'll gamble for $75,000. Ooh, bigger rush. Whether you win or lose, it was the rush you were looking for. But when they wake up the next morning after the drugs wear off, or the shopping is done, or the strip club, or whatever people do, the feeling's back. So then they think, how am I going to make this feeling go away? And so the external thing, with that internal chemical change, just like the baby who looks for milk, is a conditioning that goes on that allows them to become addicted. And so then this gap between the way we appear and who we really are becomes the very foundation of why people can't find happiness in their life. So this is why the law of attraction doesn't work for people, a lot of people, because they think they want to accumulate more things, right? To attract more things, and they think that'll make that feeling go away. The universal law does not work that way. The law of attraction will not work for that person until we look at that emotion instead of turning on the TV or getting on the computer or getting on the phone or playing a video game or getting on the internet or whatever people do to distract them, to say, what is this feeling? I'm unhappy. I'm empty. I'm suffering. I'm going to look at this feeling. What are the thoughts that I think when I feel this way? What are the behaviors that I perform and demonstrate? And what are the states of mind that I live in? What is my attitude? What are the other feelings that are derived from this? And let's make conscious all of those unconscious thoughts. Now, the person is in the process of change. They're pulling out from the unconscious, subconscious, and bringing it to the conscious so that they can gain more control over it. Now, as they begin to make the steps for personal change and unlearning and relearning, what I call pruning and sprouting, the death of the old self and the cultivation of the new self, whatever we want to call that, that emotional memory that they've identified themselves as a personality could have been that same emotional memory from the time they were 12 or 13 or 15. And that's when their life stopped. And that they lived by that same emotion, and that same emotion has been driving their thoughts and behaviors for the last 20 or 30 years. And now they're running away from that feeling by doing all the things, being perfect, being smart, being good, trying to be right, being successful, whatever they do to run away from that feeling. But as we begin to address the feeling and unlearn that feeling, we get closer to how we appear as who we really are. And the energy that's been holding this in place is emotion. And emotion is energy. And as we do this, and we unlearn that emotion, we're releasing that energy back into the quantum field, back into our life. And that energy now can be reorganized into a new reality, into a new life. And so the unlearning process has its effects in the quantum field as well. It's not just so that we feel better, because energy and emotion and the thoughts that are driven by those emotions are the electromagnetic field that affect every single atom in our life. The thought driven by the emotion is the electrical charge. And the emotion driven by the thought is the magnetic charge. And that field that we create holds every single atom in our life in stasis or in movement. And so if you can see, if we start owning the emotion, or freeing ourselves from the emotions, or becoming unattached to the emotion, that's energy now. And electromagnetism and thought that is now released as pure energy to be reorganized into our life. Now, if we can then take that energy and begin to think in new ways, and begin to feel in new ways, and create an elevated state of self. So we should see some measurable changes in our life. In other words, we should have feedback from our world, from our reality, that is measurable as a result of our intentions, our behaviors, and our feelings. And that should come in a way that we can't predict. It should be surprising. The greater mind should organize that event for us. All we have to do is unhook ourselves from that frozen state and begin to become neuroplastic and loose. And so we become scientists in our life then if we play this game properly. Because we can begin to track our thoughts and our emotions, our thoughts and our feelings, with the electromagnetic field that we're creating. And if we're maintaining that modified state of mind and body for our entire day, there should be something different that shows up in our world, if not that day, within a certain period of time. And we don't have to force that. All we have to do is live in joy. Because by living in joy, we already said that it's already here. We've already accepted that the outcome has happened, and that's the magnet. Joy is the magnet that draws the events to us. If we create in joy, and then we get up and live in pain, we're pushing that event away from us the whole entire time. But if we create in joy, and then we live in joy, we're drawing electromagnetically the events to us. And so when we break through and we create transparency, which is how we appear is who we really are, and we've changed the emotional memories that we've memorized, all that energy is free energy or raw material to begin to create new opportunities and new experiences in our life. But it never ends. There's always more to refine. There's always more to get better at. And when we're like this or close to this, and how we appear is who we really are, and we're happy because we've broken through the chains of our emotional addictions or our emotional habits. And we've gone on when the body has said, I'm tired, or I don't want to do this, or you can start tomorrow, or I don't feel like it. And we've persisted on and we've broken through. That's when true joy and true self-love is made manifest. And when it's made manifest in that way, and we love ourselves for what we've overcome, then we're happy without the environment. And when we're happy without the environment and we're flourishing and it's moving through us, that's when the law of attraction really works now, because we don't need the environment or things any longer to make us happy. And when we don't need them anymore, that's the moment it happens. I think there's a strong awakening that's happening, and I'm concerned because the way the human condition usually works is that crisis usually has to be the derivative for change. There has to be breakdowns in systems before there's revolution. Because, we live in the culture where comfort is so important and convenience is so necessary, and corporate choices in corporate America has pretty much lulled us to sleep. So there's a lot of changes happening globally where people are beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, the world needs some intervention and needs some help. And I always say that the three brain systems, from thinking to doing to being, are so important for all of us. You can't focus on or pray for peace, because you can meditate in a city and meditate on peace, and the crime rates will lower during that time. But as soon as those people leave the community, the crime rates return back to normal levels. So it's not enough to just think. It's not enough to just have an intention. We have to actually demonstrate peace. We've got to teach the body, right, to break the habit of war. If war is within us, or aggression is within us, why would we focus on peace and then go, you shake hands at church and say, peace be with you, and then you get in your car and you cut everybody off to get to wherever you need to go? That's the human condition. So we have to demonstrate it. We have to teach the body what the mind is intellectually understanding. We have to make choices, conscious choices, that transcend our typical mannerisms and our typical characteristics and temperaments. And so now when we're demonstrating peace, or the emotional state of love, or the emotional state of freedom, and repeat it at will enough times that we can move into a state of being, now we've memorized an internal chemical state, and now we have, say, 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 people all moving through that process. Now, if they're in a state of being, they're beyond reproach. They're beyond control. No corporation is going to have them compromised because they're in a state of being that's worked for them. No comfort, bribery of comfort is going to be of interest to them because they've made it to a point of being. And when we're in a point of being, we've mastered it. We've mastered ourselves. And so I think humanity needs to go through the process from thinking to doing to being. And as I said in my lecture on Sunday, I don't know why, the only thing that I want material is an electric car. Well, because I have a problem with oil, and I have a problem with global warming, and I have a problem with the wars and the way things are working. But I could never stand up and fight for those things if I'm driving a gas car. But if I have solar panels and I have my electric car and it needs no gasoline at all, now I've made choices that are consistent with my thinking. Now my intention is in alignment with my behavior, or my behavior is in line with my intention, or my actions are equal to my thoughts. Now my body's getting involved. And if I'm making those choices, and I'm able to make consistent choices within that realm, I will move into a state of being that's beyond reliance. So now, if you tried to bribe the person who's done that, if you tried to manipulate them in some way, or tried to cash them out, or do something to control them, that person is in a state of being, and there's nothing that you can do that can move them from that. Imagine 3 billion people in that state of mind. What kind of world we would have. So a leader is someone who has their thoughts and their actions aligned, their mind and their body working together. A politician who has the mind saying one thing and their body doing something else. And so true leaders, whether it was Martin Luther King or William Wallace or Mother Teresa, they were leaders because they were living as if the dream was happening now. And they were uncompromising to it. And it didn't matter what was happening in their environment, the circumstances. It didn't matter if someone was threatening their life with their body. They didn't even care about their body. It didn't matter how long it took. So they were beyond survival. They were visionaries. They were creators. And so I think our goal is to begin to make choices that may be somewhat uncomfortable, that may be so inconvenient in the beginning, and to stay conscious. Because, media and television and entertainment distracts us from the immediate issues. Not only on a global level, but within us as well. And as we begin to move away from the ego, being selfish, to being selfless, because we've overcome the survival emotions, those negative emotions that drive us to fear and anger and hatred. Those are driven by the emotional chemicals of stress. Well, if we're able to mediate that stress response and be able to control it and reinvent a new self that's based on altruistic feelings and emotions, then the only thing we care about is contributing. Because I say, when you have everything you want in the world materially, all the wealth you want in the world, the only thing you care about now is making a difference. So if you've overcome things about yourself emotionally, then the only thing you're going to want to do is figure out how you're going to make a difference in the world, how you're going to contribute, how you're going to be selfless. And if we have enough people working on themselves within that realm to become selfless and being contributed, considering the whole, making decisions to include everybody instead of just the self, we would see pretty dramatic changes taking place in this world.